Picture this. You are standing in the middle of a bustling, dusty square in ancient Mesopotamia, roughly 5,000 years ago. In your left hand, you are holding 20 pounds of fresh, glistening fish that you caught this morning at the muddy banks of the river. In your right hand, you are desperately hungry, and you want a sharp, new bronze knife from the local artisan to skin an animal. You walk up to the blacksmith and offer him the fish. The blacksmith looks at your fish, looks at his knife, and slowly shakes his head. He says, "I already have too many fish. They are going to rot by tomorrow. If you want this knife, bring me 3 goats." You stare at the blacksmith in complete despair. You don't have 3 goats, you only have fish. And right there, in that awkward, frustrating moment of early human commerce, you have just run into the single biggest bottleneck in the history of human civilization, the coincidence of wants. For the longest time, a popular myth has been taught in almost every economics classroom around the world. We are told that before money existed, humans used a simple barter system. You had chickens, your neighbor had wheat, you swapped them, everyone went home happy. Except, historical and anthropological evidence shows that's largely a fairy tale. Pure barter economies, where people directly exchange goods without any common medium of measure, almost never existed in human history, except perhaps as a last resort between total strangers or warring tribes who didn't trust each other at all. Why? Because barter is brutally inefficient. It requires a double coincidence of wants. For a trade to happen, you don't just need someone who has what you want. You also need that exact same person to desperately want the specific, perishable, hard-to-carry thing that you happen to have. If you're a professional arrow maker and you want a pair of leather boots, you have to find a shoemaker who happens to need a fresh batch of flint arrowheads right at that exact second. What happens if the shoemaker isn't hungry, doesn't need arrows, and only wants fresh milk? Your economic system grinds to a complete halt. So, how did a species of primates move from swapping dead fish and flintstones to carrying around shiny metal coins, digital digits, and global currencies? How did humans invent money? To answer that, we have to look away from the marketplace and look instead toward the state, the temple, and the deep architecture of human trust. Long before anyone minted a metal coin, early agricultural societies needed a way to keep score. When human populations grew from small, tight-knit hunter-gatherer bands into massive, complex cities in regions like Sumer and ancient Egypt, a massive logistical nightmare emerged. Centralized governments and temples were organizing thousands of workers to build massive irrigation canals, ziggurats, and grain silos. How do you feed, pay, and provision an army of 10,000 laborers who are spending all day digging mud? You can't just hand them random items. You need a universal yardstick of value. And this is where the true origin of money begins. Not as a medium of exchange in a free market, but as a system of debt and credit. Anthropologist David Graeber pointed out that long before coins jingled in pockets, ancient temple ledgers were full of numbers. If a worker labored for the state building a wall, the temple didn't pay him immediately with a cow or a bundle of wheat. Instead, the temple wrote down a credit on a clay tablet. The state owes this worker a specific amount of value. To make this system work, societies began using standardized commodities as units of account. In Mesopotamia, that unit was the shekel. But here's the twist. A shekel wasn't a coin. It was a measure of weight, specifically about 8.3 grams of barley. Think about that for a second. When an ancient merchant said something cost 10 shekels, he didn't mean 10 physical objects stamped with a king's face. He literally meant an amount of barley weighing as much as 10 standard shekels. Barley was heavy, it took up massive amounts of space, and it rotted if it got wet. But everyone needed it, everyone ate it, and therefore everyone agreed it had baseline value. Other cultures picked different yardsticks. In ancient Mesoamerica, it was cacao beans. In various parts of the world, it was cowrie shells, blocks of pressed salt, livestock, or beaver pelts. These were commodity currencies. They had intrinsic utility. You could eat cacao, you could use salt to preserve meat, you could wear fur to stay warm. But commodity currencies had a massive expiration date. Salt dissolves in the rain, grain spoils, cattle get sick and die of foot and mouth disease. If you wanted to store your wealth over 20 years to pass down to your children, keeping it in a pile of rotting grain was a terrible financial strategy. Humanity needed something better, something durable, scarce, divisible, and universally desired. Enter metal. Copper, bronze, silver, and gold changed everything. Unlike wheat or livestock, metal doesn't spoil if you leave it in a damp cave. You can melt it down, shape it into jewelry, hammer it flat, divide it into smaller pieces, and combine it back together without losing its fundamental substance. At first, metal was traded as raw ingots, rings, or axes. If you wanted to buy a piece of land, you didn't count out individual coins, you brought a bronze axe or a silver bar, pulled out a scale, and weighed it right there in front of the seller to make sure you weren't getting scammed. Every single transaction required a weighing scale and a purity test. Imagine walking down to the local market today, and every time you wanted to buy a cup of coffee, the barista had to pull out a chemical kit to make sure your dollar bill wasn't fake, and a miniature scale to weigh your paper currency. It would be exhausting. That friction sparked the next great leap in financial technology, the invention of coinage. Around the 7th century BCE, in the kingdom of Lydia, modern-day Turkey, someone had a brilliant paradigm-shifting idea. Instead of forcing citizens to weigh messy chunks of metal every single time they bought a loaf of bread, what if an authoritative power like a king or a government took certified blobs of metal, stamped a royal seal onto them, and guaranteed their exact weight and purity? Thus, the official coin was born. Lydian coins were made of electrum, a naturally occurring alloy of gold and silver. Stamping a lion's head or a king's portrait onto a coin meant that anyone holding it didn't need a scale anymore. The stamp was a guarantee. This piece of metal is certified by the state to weigh exactly 5 grams of pure gold. Coins were an absolute economic superpower. They accelerated trade across the Mediterranean, turned local villages into sprawling international market economies, and allowed empires to collect taxes with terrifying efficiency. Because once a king declared, "All taxes must be paid using coins stamped with my face," an incredible thing happened. Every single citizen suddenly needed those specific coins. Even if you lived out in a remote farming village and grew your own food, you had to sell some of your crops for royal coins just so you wouldn't be dragged off to prison for failing to pay your taxes. Coins weren't just convenient tools for trade. They were instruments of sovereign control. Yet, as empires grew, carrying heavy pouches of gold and silver coins across dangerous, bandit-filled trade routes became a massive liability. If you were a merchant traveling from China to Europe along the Silk Road, carrying a wagon load of heavy silver coins made you an instant target for highway robbers. This led to the next massive evolution of money: paper money and digital abstraction. During the Tang and Song dynasties in China, merchants dealing in heavy iron and copper coins started depositing their metal money with trustworthy local deposit shops or government agencies. In return, the shop gave them a lightweight paper receipt documenting exactly how much metal they had safely locked away in the vault. Soon, merchants realized something amazing. Instead of walking miles back to the vault to withdraw heavy coins to pay a supplier, they could just hand the paper receipt directly to the supplier. The supplier could then use that paper receipt to buy something else. The paper itself became trusted money, backed by the promise of the metal sitting miles away. Europe caught on to this idea centuries later, giving birth to modern banking, paper banknotes, and central banks. The logic of money shifted away from physical substance entirely. A dollar bill or a euro note has virtually zero intrinsic value. You can't eat cotton paper, and you certainly can't build a house out of it. Its value exists purely as a shared psychological illusion, a collective social contract backed by the police, the laws, and the stability of the state that issued it. Today, we have entered yet another radical phase of this evolutionary journey. Most of the money you use isn't even printed on paper anymore. It exists as invisible magnetic pulses on computer servers, digital numbers flashing on your smartphone screen when you tap a card at a checkout counter, or decentralized cryptographic ledgers floating across global networks. When you trace the journey from a stressed hunter-gatherer holding a stinky fish by a river in Mesopotamia, to a merchant weighing lumps of silver on a Lydian scale, to a digital pixel moving across a screen today, you realize something profound. Money has never actually been about gold, paper, or numbers. Money is trust. It is a technological social tool designed to bridge the gap between strangers, allowing millions of people who have never met to cooperate, build civilizations, and dream of a shared future. From a simple primitive tally mark on a clay tablet to the complex financial systems running our modern world, money remains the most powerful and imaginative invention in human history.